love the gospel of the Lord.
Heart to Heart, a Catholic media ministry, presents an inspiring gospel reflection by Father Michael Sparrow. Father Michael is a Jesuit priest working as a writer and retreat master at the Bellarmine Jesuit Retreat House outside Chicago.
The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Jesus said to his disciples, "Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Stop judging, and you will not be judged. Stop condemning, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and gifts will be given to you. A good measure, packed together, shaken down, and overflowing, will be poured into the folds of your garments. For the measure with which you measure will be measured back to you." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
For the measure with which you measure will be measured back to you. Those are frightening words. All of us want to be forgiven, and yet how hard it is to extend that forgiveness. Right there in the center of the Lord's Prayer, Jesus, in a similar phrase, says, "Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Forgive us as we forgive." Lord, I hope that dirty so-and-so rots in hell because of what they did to me. And Lord, I hope I rot in hell because of my inability to be able to forgive. Forgive us as we forgive. The measure you measure will be measured back to you. This morning I woke up reflecting on the gospel, knowing I would be preaching on it. And one of my favorite poems by T.S. Eliot came to mind, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. And he has the line there, "I have measured out my life in coffee spoons." These tiny little spoons that you use for cream or sugar. Keeping track of, she hurt me, yes. He said something mean to me, okay. Keeping track, carefully noting all of what's going on. Today's day of prayer is a day about praying for a magnanimity of heart as we enter into this forgiveness exchange. And the gears of that exchange are greased by grace. A biblical example that comes to mind is a wonderful story of the tax collector Zacchaeus. Do you remember the story as Luke tells it in his gospel? He's a short little guy. Jesus is coming into the town, and he wants to be able to see Jesus. So what does he do? He climbs up a tree, and Jesus is passing by. And Jesus looks up and sees him. Because Zacchaeus has strategically positioned himself not only so that he can see Jesus, but he will be seen. First movement of grace of Zacchaeus responding to this itinerant preacher, healer, with these words that were tugging at his heart. And then Jesus picks up and he volleys back. Zacchaeus takes the first move. He goes up to the tree. Jesus tosses the ball to him and says, "Zacchaeus, come down from that tree. I mean to have dinner at your house tonight." What's the next movement? All the people grumbling, does he know who he is? He's a tax collector. He cheated me on my last returns. He's very wealthy, of course, because he's defrauded everybody. There's no such thing in that society as a poor tax collector. The grumbling is going on, and Jesus hears it, and Zacchaeus hears it. He comes down from the tree, and he says, "If I've defrauded anybody, I'm going to pay him back many times more, and I'm going to give half my belongings away to those in need." His heart cracks open. The Word not only sits on top of his heart cracks open and the Word of God falls inside. And Jesus points to him and says, this day's salvation has come to this house. He's a true man of Israel. A contemporary example of that is in the story of one of my heroes, Cardinal Bernardin, who was falsely accused on November 11th, 1993, of perpetrating sexual abuse by a young man then living in Philadelphia by the name of Stephen Cook. When Cardinal Bernardin was Archbishop Bernardin living in Cincinnati, Stephen Cook was a seminarian at the time. He came forward to the archdiocese and said, one of the priests at the seminary sexually abused me. The Archdiocese of Cincinnati didn't believe him. That wound festered in Stephen's heart. And we found a sympathetic lawyer, and he found a priest who had a grudge against Cardinal Bernardin, and he found a willing television network to hear his story. A perfect storm erupted, and he came before the world and said, in the midst of a false memory, Cardinal Bernardin abused me. Now, that's not shocking stuff today. That was more than 25 years ago. But Cardinal Bernardin was the first major cleric to be accused of sexual abuse, and this was international headlines. This was scandal and horror. How could such a thing happen? Bernardin was arguably, at that time, the most powerful cleric in the United States. It took 100 days of Cardinal Bernardin living in hell before Stephen Cook realized that he had been the victim of a false memory, induced by a hypnotherapist who had taken a correspondence class in hypnotherapy and who had no idea that that testimony would ever come into court. Stephen recanted, said, I don't trust my memory. I trust my memory that I was abused as a seminarian in Cincinnati, and that case went forward and was settled out of court with the Archdiocese of Cincinnati for an undisclosed amount of money. And the priest that Stephen Cook accused was ordered into therapy. The priest refused, and he left the priesthood, and then several other accusations came out against him. But the case against Cardinal Bernardin was dropped. And many would say that that trauma is what triggered pancreatic cancer in Cardinal Bernardin. Stephen Cook, who was dying of AIDS at the time, reached out to Cardinal Bernardin. Why did he reach out to Cardinal Bernardin? Because after the case had been dropped, several months later, Cardinal Bernardin reached out to Stephen Cook. The case had been dropped, and that could have been the end of it. But Cardinal Bernardin knew that there wasn't reconciliation between him and Stephen. And so he took the initiative discreetly, far from the public eye. He contacted a friend of his in Cincinnati, who was the pastor of a parish where Stephen's mother worshiped, and asked if Stephen's mother would broker a meeting, if Stephen would be open to a meeting. And Stephen's mother contacted him, and they arranged for a meeting in Philadelphia. And then very quietly, Cardinal Bernardin, with one other priest, flew to Philadelphia, met at the seminary there with Stephen and one of his friends, so that they could meet face to face. Because reconciliation comes from the Latin word concilium, that means eyelash to eyelash, eyeball to eyeball, face to face, heart to heart. Cardinal Bernardin needed to meet with Stephen face to face. And the Cardinal said, "Stephen, do you still believe that I abused you?" And Stephen said, "No, I don't." And then Stephen asked for forgiveness. And the Cardinal gave that freely, willingly. And then asked Stephen if he would like to celebrate Eucharist. Stephen had been estranged from the church. He told the story that he was so angry at the Catholic Church for his abuse accusation not going anywhere that he was in a hotel room and he picked up the Bible that was in the hotel and he flung it against the wall in furious anger. He had prayed that the Catholic Church might be destroyed. Here Cardinal Bernardin said, "Would you like to celebrate Eucharist?" At first Stephen was taken back, but he sensed the sincerity of the Cardinal and the Word of God that was in his heart, as his heart cracked open at that point, and the Word of God fell in. And Stephen said, "Yes, I'd like to celebrate Eucharist." And a fuller reconciliation took place. Not just Cardinal Bernardin's reconciliation with Stephen, but Stephen's reconciliation with God. The God whom he felt had abandoned him came to his doorstep, knocked on the door of his heart. And sometime later, when Cardinal Bernardin was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, Stephen was the first one to send a note to the Cardinal saying, "I'm praying for you. I'd like to come to visit you." What developed from that fractured relationship was a beautiful friendship between these two men. One dying of pancreatic cancer, the other one dying of AIDS. They spoke on the phone several times, exchanged letters. Stephen was never able to come to Chicago because the HIV took a turn for the worst, and he died before he was able to visit the Cardinal. But he died as a member of the Catholic Church. He died reconciled to the Church, to God, and fully reconciled with himself and with this man whom he had falsely accused. Here's a paradigm that Dr. Avis Clendenin has written in her book that I've told in a video in which Dr. Avis and I participated, and other key players in that whole exchange. Forgiveness is possible. Reconciliation is possible. But only if we are willing to take those extraordinary steps to heal the fractures, of climb the tree, to recognize we all have limitations of some sort, but we can climb the tree of forgiveness. We can take that first step. We can recognize that what's more important than our money and the things that we own are the things we carry in our heart, the relationships that we carry in our heart. We celebrate that this day. It's at the heart of the Lenten journey. It's at the critical center of today's gospel. For the measure we measure out will be measured back to us. In coffee spoons or in giant buckets. Amen? Amen.
gospel